Hi, I'm Missy with On William Street. This week we're going to talk about binding your quilt. If you've been quilting along with us, then your floppy disk quilt is complete. You've got all the quilting done on it. You are ready to bind that quilt. So a couple of things that I want to point out is we had some leftover backing fabric on the sides of this quilt, and a lot of times we do have backing fabric left over on our quilts. So we like to use that backing fabric for the binding because, well, it makes the quilting a little bit cheaper. We might as well use up the scraps. So we like to use that where we can. So there are a couple of different ways that you can trim this quilt. One, you can just take your scissors and then just cut all the way around the edge. So that's one way you can trim the quilt. If you're worried about it being square, if you were a little bit concerned as you were sewing the blocks together that it wasn't completely square, then go ahead and pull out your cutting mat, your ruler, and your rotary cutter, because your ruler is going to give you this nice square edge that you can use to square up your quilt if you're worried about any of those little corners or something looking off. So for this today, I'm going to go ahead and just trim everything with the scissors, and then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of double check with my ruler and my cutting mat just to make sure that everything is nice and square. One more way to make sure that your quilt is squared up and ready to go is really as simple as folding it. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've trimmed it all off, folded the quilt in half, and then we're going to fold the quilt in half again. And you can really, even just by eyeballing it, see how square it ended up. And if your quilt is really off, you can go ahead and trim off a little bit more. Or if you're okay with a couple of spots where it's got a little bit of a wave, you can go ahead and leave those on. But this is another simple way to just square that quilt up for you. We've got all of our binding strips cut. So what I've done is I've cut everything at 2¼ inches. That's how we like to do our binding. If you would prefer a little bit of a wider binding, you can do 2½ inches, but I like to have a thin binding, so we do 2¼ inches. And what you're going to do is you're going to take all your strips. Now when you're doing a solid, it doesn't really matter how you're going to throw this together, just because you don't have to worry about having prints and right sides together with our solids. But if you are doing prints, you want to make sure that you're doing your right sides together as you're doing this. So we're going to take our second strip, and we're going to place it over the top of our first strip. Don't worry about making sure that those lines are all lined up, because if you look at it, that's not exactly square. But that's okay. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to take our little ruler and our fabric pen, draw a line from corner to corner on this, and then we're going to go ahead and sew right on that line, and then we'll go ahead and trim the extra off. And you don't need to worry about back stitching when you're doing binding, because all of those stitches are going to be inside the binding. But if you would prefer, you can absolutely do so. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and just finish with the rest of our strips. Now all of our seams are done, so we'll go ahead and clip between the seams, clip the threads. This thread's hanging on. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and just trim this off, and just about 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be exact, but just trim it off. And then we'll go ahead and go over to the iron and iron these seams. So on our seams, I like to press these open. And the reason I like to press them open is it just helps reduce some of the bulk in your binding. So if you have a preference and you kind of do this a couple of times and you decide that you like to press them to one side instead, you can absolutely do that. But I am going to press mine open. And because we use these strips from the back of our quilt, we have nice long strips, which means you have less binding seams. I'm wrapped around my cord. Now we've got those pressed open. The next thing that we're going to do is press our binding in half, and this will just help as we go back to the machine to sew it all on. When you're pressing it in half, make sure that you're pressing it so that these are on the inside. We don't want that to show when we're finished binding our quilt and have those seams be on the outside. So make sure they are inside when you press. And just go all the way through and just do a light press on your binding. Our binding is done. We've got it all ironed and we're ready to sew it to our quilt. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew it onto the back of our quilt. And the reason for this is when we turn it over, we're going to come back over afterwards and sew the binding onto the front of the quilt. Now, if you want to hand bind your quilt, what you'll do is instead of sewing this side onto the back of the quilt, you're going to sew it onto the front of the quilt, and then you're going to hand tack it along the back. But I do like to use machine binding, so I am going to go ahead and sew it onto the back. Now you want to make sure that you leave a nice little tail for you. So typically about 12 inches or so is what I like to leave as a tail. So go ahead and put that onto the back of your quilt, and what we're going to do is sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way around. And I do like to back stitch this right at the beginning. Now you're probably wondering, if I'm sewing a 1/4 inch seam all the way around, how is that corner going to work? I promise it will work. I'll show you when we get there. If you're worried about having your needle move as you're picking up the quilt and moving it around and adding more binding to it, you can always make sure that your needle is pointed down before you start moving things around. Okay, we are almost to our first corner, so I want to make sure that I'm not going all the way to the edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down about 1/4 inch in. Don't worry about it being exact, but get as close as you can. So eyeball it. That's about 1/4 inch. I'm going to do a quick little back stitch, just 1 or 2, just because I like having that just extra little bit of stability and just good anchor. Then I'm going to go ahead and lift my foot up, pull it out. And this is the trick that's going to get our corners on that front a nice mitered corner and be perfect. We're going to fold this over, so away from the quilt. Make sure that you've got a nice edge there. nice 90-degree edge, and then you're going to fold it back down over the top of your quilt. And then we're just going to come back right along here and do a quick little back stitch at this spot and sew 1/4 of an inch all the way down. Don't worry about these extra threads. They're going to be hidden in the binding when we fold it over and finish it up. The binding is almost all the way on. As you can see, I've left us about a 12-inch section or so with pieces on either side. Now we need to combine those pieces so that we get one continuous binding all the way around. So what I want to do for that, first I want to measure it. So I'm going to line these up on top of each other. Make sure they're nice and flush against the quilt back so we don't end up with any puckers or anything. And then I want to go ahead and make a mark. So I'm going to go ahead and make a mark on both sides of my binding strips, on all of those. Okay, so we've got that marked. Then we're going to take our binding and we're going to unfold it. So this is one piece, and then we have our second piece. And the reason I marked it on both sides is because I don't always remember exactly which top and bottom it's going to need to have that mark on. That's why I do both sides. Then when I unfold it, it's good to go. So we're going to take these pieces, line them up. Got to kind of finagle this, get it nice and flat. As Kimmy mentioned, quilting can be a workout, especially when you're binding a king-size quilt. You get a good arm workout. And then you just want to line it up there, and you want to line them up at the top. So once you've got those lined up, I like to throw a couple of pins in to keep it in place. This just helps, since you've got a quilt attached to this already, it just helps to keep these from moving on you so you can finish up your binding. Okay, and then we are going to again draw our line from corner to corner. And sew on that line. Okay, and this, I don't really worry about taking it back to the iron and ironing that seam flat after I've got it trimmed. We're just going to finger press it. But first we want to cut off all this extra batting. Before you cut off all that extra batting, I like to do just a quick little test. So just a little stretch test. Make sure, yep, that's the amount we need. It's going to line up nicely there. Trim that seam down. We're just going to do a quick little finger press. And then sew the rest of that binding on. Okay, now we're ready to flip it over and do the front. Now for the front of our quilt, what I like to do is switch out my foot. So this foot is a stitch in the ditch foot, so you can see it's got this line right there in the center of the foot. And what that's going to do, when we've got our quilt flipped over, you can go ahead and keep that lined up right there next to the fabric, and then we'll move our needle over so that we can sew right there across the top all the way around. You don't have to have a stitch in the ditch foot to do binding. You can just go ahead and use a regular foot and do one of two things. Either just keep your needle nice and close to that edge, or if you are more comfortable, you can move your needle position over one to just kind of give you a little bit of cushion. But I am going to go ahead and switch to my stitch in the ditch foot because I do have it and I love to use it. Our foot's been switched and we are ready to get that binding attached on the front. Now one thing that we like to do is we've got these handy binding clips that we're going to use that will just help keep things in place as you're working. You don't have to have these. Pins work just as well, and honestly I really just like them just to start it off, and then also when we get around to the corners they help a little bit there as well. So we're going to throw a couple of these in and then we'll go ahead and start sewing our quilt. Now we've got our foot down here. I want to make sure that I moved over a couple on my needle position. I do like to use two. It just gives me a little bit of leeway as I'm going right against this. And we've got my stitch in the ditch foot that's going to be right there, go along right next to that binding. And then also I want to put my needle down. So if you have this option on your machine, this just makes it really nice as you're going around. So if you're having to pick up your foot or maneuver your quilt a little bit, your needle's not going to move on you. If you don't have that, just make sure that you turn your needle back down if you're going to be messing with the quilt too much so that you don't lose your spot. We'll do a quick little back stitch. Now I don't leave these binding clips in through the whole process. I really just like to have them as I start the quilt because I like to have the option is really holding with my fingers. And then I like to put my hand in the back too, just kind of help that along, keeps it nice and flat. As you can see, that foot keeps everything just right there along that edge nicely. Make sure all of our little threads are on the inside of that binding. And you also want to make sure that you're pulling your binding over far enough that you're not going to get your stitching from the back of the binding showing on the front of your quilt. See, as we get to one of these seams, this is why I like to press it open, see, because it feels a little flatter instead of having a big bulk on one side or the other that you have to kind of mess with your foot as you get closer to it. Okay, we're almost getting to that corner. I want to make sure I stop a little ahead of the corner. So we'll go ahead, stop there, and we're going to get that corner prepped. So what we're going to do, so we get a nice mitered corner on there. So we want to make sure that this is folded nice and flat, even all the way to the end. And then we're going to sew not quite all the way, but we are going to sew about down to here. But make sure it's nice and flat and you got that nice angle. Okay, and then before I get too close, I want to make sure that I've got this flipped over. So this is where either some pins or again the binding clips are really good, come in handy. Like I said, those extra threads from putting the binding on, we're just going to tuck them under. So you're going to take it, you want to make sure you've got that nice angle. You're going to fold this up, just kind of use your fingers to maneuver it in. So now you can see we've got that nice mitered corner. Things are lining up just really nicely right there. I'm going to go ahead, pick this up over the top of it, make sure it's not falling in. There we go. And we're going to sew to that corner. You can pick up your foot a little bit if it gets caught on that folded fabric. Okay, we're going to sew right to that corner. This is where you definitely want to make sure your needle is down. Flip that over. And then sew down. And that will catch that corner and give you a nice mitered edge right there. So as you can see, when we do that mitered, we get a nice mitered corner right here. And we get our binding all the way over and then down with the stitching. Now if you get a little too far in or not quite as far enough in, don't worry about it. You should see some of the beginning quilts that I did. They don't look great. Even this one, there's a corner that I got off a little bit. We're just not going to show you. But it just takes time. Just practice, keep working at it. You can always do a quick little, if it's really bad, unpick it, do the corner again, and keep going. Okay. Congratulations, you are now finished with your first quilt. The binding is on and it is ready to go. So grab your favorite book, a cup of hot chocolate, and snuggle up because you have earned it. We would love to see your quilt, so share with them. If you're sharing them on Instagram or Facebook, please tag us so that we can see what you're working on. And then don't forget to follow us on Instagram so that you can see the different projects and the ideas and things that we're coming up with. Hopefully it will inspire you to continue your quilting journey. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it so that you can make sure you don't miss any of our future videos. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website and you'll get links every time we post something new. And don't forget, you can get this floppy disk pattern in our subscriber library. And we'll see you next week.